In the grand ballrooms of Regency London, the moonlit gardens of France, the sun-kissed villas of Italy, and the passionate streets of Spain, love has always found a way. Here, we bring you original historical romance stories filled with passion, sacrifice, and unforgettable destinies. Before tonight's tale begins, don't forget to subscribe and join our growing community of romantics from around the world. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Now settle in and let history whisper its most beautiful secrets. There is a kind of man who believes, after enough years of being responsible for everything, that he has finished with feeling. Not that he has decided against it, not that he has buried it deliberately, simply that the machinery of feeling has, like an instrument left too long without use, grown quiet from disuse, and is unlikely to start again without considerable effort, which he does not intend to make. James Cavendish, the 8th Duke of Ashmore, was that kind of man, and he had been that kind of man since approximately the age of 26, which was the year his father died, and his younger brother died in the same month, and he became responsible for an estate in Wiltshire, another in Yorkshire, a seat in the House of Lords, 400 tenants, and the ongoing question of producing an heir, all at once, without a moment of preparation. He was 34 years old now, and he had managed all of it with the particular efficiency of a man who has transformed grief into productivity, because the alternative was to simply stop, and stopping was not something the 8th Duke of Ashmore was permitted to do. He had never married. Not for lack of candidates, he was the 8th Duke of Ashmore, which meant that candidates materialized with the regularity of English rain and roughly as much variation. He had come close, once, at 28, to a young woman from Shropshire who had laughed in a way that made him feel, briefly, as though the machinery might start after all. But the lawyers had found a complication in her family's situation, and his own family had made their opinion clear, and the young woman had married someone else the following year, and seemed, by all accounts, contented. He had told himself he was also contented, which was not the same thing as being contented, but was, in the manner of most self-deceiving statements, sufficient for daily use. He came to Spain in the autumn of 1823 for reasons that were primarily practical. His estates included a shipping interest that had, in the years following the Napoleonic Wars, developed considerable trade along the Spanish coast, and there were negotiations in Seville that his man of business had managed for 2 years, and was now insisting required the Duke's personal presence. James had agreed without particular enthusiasm, and had arranged to spend 6 weeks in Andalusia, conduct his business with the usual efficiency, and return to England before Christmas. He had brought with him his private secretary, Mr. Thomas Bourne, who was 23, studiously organized, and privately found his employer's determination to find everything unremarkable one of the more challenging aspects of an otherwise excellent position. He had also brought, at the insistence of his friend Lord Dalmor, a letter of introduction to the Marqués de Villanueva, one of the great families of Seville, which Lord Dalmor had promised would open every door in Andalusian society, should the Duke find himself with any interest indoors. James had accepted the letter with the polite indifference of a man who does not expect to find anything behind doors that will surprise him. He was wrong, as it happened, but it took him some time to understand how wrong. Seville received him differently than he expected, which was the first surprise, because James was not a man who expected to be surprised. He had been to Paris and Rome and Vienna and had found them each, in their various ways, essentially comprehensible, different in surface from England, but working on the same underlying assumptions about how life was organized, and what mattered, and how people presented themselves to the world. He had expected Seville to be similarly comprehensible. It was not. The city moved at a different rhythm than anything he had encountered, slower in the heat of the afternoon, which collapsed into a stillness that English productivity would have found alarming, and then suddenly alive in the evening in a way that had no English equivalent, the streets filling with voices and music, and the smell of orange blossom and roasting meat, and the peculiar warm darkness of a southern night that felt nothing like northern darkness, which was cold and discouraging. The light was different from English light, not the thin, precise light of winter England, but something richer and more definitive, that made colors behave differently and made shadows fall at angles he was not accustomed to. He noticed this the way he noticed most things, which was accurately and without particular feeling. He conducted his business meetings in the mornings, found them productive, and spent his afternoons in the various practical tasks that an English duke conducting foreign negotiations required. He was efficient. He was correct. He was exactly what he had been in Wiltshire and Yorkshire and the House of Lords, with the addition of more sun and considerably better wine. The letter of introduction to the Marquise de Villanueva he presented in his second week, more from the habit of thoroughness than from any real expectation. He was received by the Marquise, a stout and spectacularly hospitable man of 60 who spoke excellent French and treated the arrival of an English duke with the generous enthusiasm of a man who collected interesting visitors the way others collected paintings. The Marquise invited him to dinner. James accepted. The dinner was what large family dinners in great houses always were: too many people, too much food, conversation that required the particular athletic social flexibility of a guest who does not know the house's internal geography. James managed it as he managed such occasions, competently and without great interest, until approximately an hour into the evening, when a woman entered the dining room late, with the unapologetic composure of someone who is habitually late and has made an entirely separate peace with it, and the Marquise rose and said, with evident pride, "My niece, the Condesa de Aranda, who was supposed to be here at 7 o'clock." The woman thus introduced looked at her uncle with an expression of serene, entirely untroubled affection that was also clearly a complete refusal to apologize. "I was reading," she said, in Spanish, and then looked at the assembled table with the clear-eyed calm of someone surveying a landscape she knows well and finds, on balance, acceptable. She was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark hair and a face that was not pretty in the conventional managed way of ballroom beauty, but arresting in a way that had nothing to do with arrangement. Strong, definite, intelligent, the kind of face that told you immediately that there was a significant person behind it, and that the significant person was not especially interested in whether you found this convenient or not. She wore dark red, which made the Marquise's other female guests, in their fashionable pale silks, look somehow less resolved than they had a moment ago. She was seated, by the architecture of the Marquise's hospitality, across the table from James. She looked at him across the table with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who has decided life is too short to begin with the polite fog of pretending not to assess, and said, in French, correctly judging that his Spanish was not yet adequate, "You are the English Duke my uncle has been expecting. He has been speaking of you for 2 weeks. I hope not unfavorably," James said. "He speaks of everyone favorably," she said. "He is constitutionally incapable of finding fault with a guest. It is his greatest quality and his greatest vulnerability." She tilted her head slightly. "I, however, reserve judgment." "And on what do you reserve it?" he asked. "On whether a person says anything true before the end of the evening," she said. "Most do not. It is very restful to not expect it." James looked at her across the soup course and felt something move in him that he could not immediately identify, because it had been long enough since it had moved that he had slightly forgotten what it felt like. It felt like attention, not the managed, professional attention he brought to business or estate matters, but the involuntary kind, the kind that orients towards something before the mind has had a chance to decide whether orienting is advisable. He said, "What would constitute something true, in your definition?" She considered this with the seriousness the question deserved, rather than the deflective lightness with which most people would have received it. "Something that costs something to say," she said at last. "Most conversation is free. You say what you know will land pleasantly, and I agree with enough of it to keep things comfortable, and we both leave the table having spent 2 hours saying nothing." She looked at him steadily. "I find I have less patience for it than I used to." "Why less than you used to?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face. Not pain exactly, but something in the neighborhood of it. "My husband died 18 months ago," she said. "When someone you love dies, you become, if you are paying attention, very impatient with the counterfeit version of things." James said after a moment, "My father and my brother died in the same month, 8 years ago. I became impatient with things I cannot name, and then, gradually, I stopped feeling impatient and simply stopped feeling, which seemed at the time like an improvement." She looked at him with an expression that was entirely different from the cool, assessing look she had worn a few minutes earlier. "More careful, more present, was it?" she asked. "An improvement." He was quiet for a moment, which was not something he was usually, at dinner tables, because he had learned to fill silences with the reliable ambient conversation of a man who knows the social contract. "No," he said, "I believe it was not." It was the first true thing he had said at a dinner table in approximately 8 years. She held his gaze for a moment, and in her dark eyes he saw the recognition of something, as though she had asked the question, not knowing whether anyone would answer it honestly, and had not, entirely, expected him to. "Good," she said quietly, and turned, with the composure of someone resetting the register, to the guest on her left, and said something warm and slightly amusing that made the whole end of the table laugh, and James sat in the sudden expansion of the dinner's social noise and thought, with more clarity than he had thought about anything in years, that something had just happened that he was going to need considerably more than 6 weeks to understand. Catalina Reyes, the Condesa de Aranda, had been born into the second tier of Andalusian nobility and had married at 22 into the first, not for the advancement, though her family had not objected to it, but because Eduardo de Aranda had been a man who read as many books as she did and argued about them with the focused pleasure of someone who wanted to be beaten occasionally and was not always disappointed. He had been 9 years older, quiet-mannered in the way of men who feel things strongly and have learned to hold them carefully, and she had loved him with the patient, clear-eyed love of a woman who knows what she has and does not take the knowing lightly. He had died of a fever in the spring of 1822, between one season and the next, without sufficient warning for either of them to say all the things that should have been said, and were left instead in the unfinished silence that follows sudden loss. She was 28 years old, with no children, a grief she carried differently than the other grief, but with equal weight, and a life in Seville that was hers, genuinely hers, which was something she had not expected and was still learning to inhabit. She had Eduardo's house, a large and beautiful building in the old part of the city, with a courtyard full of orange trees, and Eduardo's library, which was the best private library in Andalusia by her entirely unbiased assessment, and a position in civilian society that was not the social position of a wife, but was something she was increasingly finding more comfortable, which was the position of a woman who had been through enough to have stopped pretending. She was not looking for anything. She had decided, with the methodical deliberateness that she brought to most of her decisions, that she was not going to spend her widowhood conducting a search for a replacement, because Eduardo was not replaceable, and she did not intend to insult the memory of what they had had by pretending that a decent enough second choice was the same thing. She had also not expected, at her uncle's dinner table, to meet an English duke who answered a difficult question honestly and then looked slightly startled by himself for doing it, as though honesty had arrived before his permission had been sought. She thought about that expression for several days afterward, the startlement of a man who had said a true thing and found himself, briefly, in territory he had not visited in some time. She recognized it. She had looked startled in the same way, in the first months after Eduardo died, when she had begun, carefully and with some difficulty, to live inside her own truth again. She did not mention this to her uncle, who was already, she could see, composing some version of a story in which the Condesa de Aranda and the English Duke of Ashmore found each other interesting, and the result was pleasant for everyone, and who would require no encouragement whatsoever to become actively unhelpful. She mentioned it instead to her closest friend, Doña Mercedes de Lorca, who was 40 and had been widowed for 5 years, and had reached a phase of life that she described as having thoroughly examined the available options and found them, with some exceptions, wanting, and who listened to the account of the dinner with the sharp attention of a woman who has known Catalina for 15 years and misses nothing. "The startlement," Mercedes said, "that is what interested you." "Among other things," Catalina said. "What other things?" He asked follow-up questions, Catalina said, which did not sound, stated plainly, like a significant observation, but Mercedes understood immediately why it was, because she had known Catalina long enough to know that what she valued most in conversation was not wit or charm or even intelligence, but the quality of attention, whether the person across from her was actually tracking what she said or was simply waiting for their own next turn. "An English duke who asks follow-up questions," Mercedes said. "This is unusual. Everything about the evening was unusual," Catalina said. "I arrived late and he did not look disapproving. Most men at my uncle's table looked disapproving. He looked interested, as though lateness might have an explanation worth knowing." "It does," Mercedes said. "You were reading." "I was," Catalina said. He did not ask what. "You wish he had." "I find I am curious what he would have asked," Catalina said, which was, for Catalina, very close to admitting something. She received, 2 days after the dinner, a note from the Marquise, who was incapable of restraint in matters of social arrangement, inviting her to join a small party he was assembling for the following Thursday, a visit to a garden outside the city that was particularly beautiful in the autumn light. The note mentioned, as though incidentally, that the Duke of Ashmore would be among the guests. Catalina looked at the note for a long moment, and then wrote back to her uncle accepting the invitation, and made a private and quite firm decision that she was going to allow herself to be curious, and nothing more. Curiosity, she had learned, was the most she could afford. The garden outside the city was everything the Marquise had promised: terraced orange groves descending toward the Guadalquivir, with fountains and old stone paths, and the particular quality of light that Andalusia produced in October, which was warm without being harsh, and fell on everything with a precision that made colors look more completely themselves than they did at other times of year. The party was 9 people, which was large enough for the social safety of a group and small enough for actual conversation, and the Marquise, with the innocent-seeming maneuver of a man who has been engineering social situations since before Catalina was born, managed within the first 20 minutes of arrival to distribute the group across the garden in such a way that she and James Cavendish were walking the same path along the upper terrace with 2 other guests, who then, by the inexorable Newtonian social physics of her uncle's management, peeled away toward a particularly interesting fountain. She and James walked for a moment in the silence that can go in several directions, toward the manageable ambient conversation of 2 strangers, or toward something less predictable. "You were reading," he said. She looked at him. "The other night, when you arrived late," he said. "Your uncle said you were reading. I have been curious what it was." She was quiet for a moment, reassessing. "A history of the Moorish kingdoms," she said. "My husband's copy." He had made notes in the margins. "I have been reading my way through his library since he died, partly because it is an excellent library, and partly because it is the closest thing I have found to a continuing conversation with him." James was quiet for a moment, in the way she had observed from the dinner, the genuine pause of a man who is actually considering, rather than filling space. "That is a very beautiful and very painful thing to do," he said. "Yes," she said, "both at once. Most of the worthwhile things are." They walked a few steps. Below them, the river was silver and slow in the afternoon light. "I have my brother's things in his old rooms at Ashmore," James said. "I have not moved them. Not because I intended to leave them as a memorial, more that every time I have thought about it, I have not been ready, and 8 years have passed and they are still there, and I have stopped thinking about it as something I will eventually do, and started thinking about it as simply how the rooms are." Catalina looked at him as they walked. "You are very honest," she said, "for an English duke. I have been told the English find this reputation for reserve both flattering and accurate," he said. "I have been told I am a particular example of it. And yet," she said. "And yet," he agreed, and looked at her briefly with something in his grey eyes that was both rueful and direct, a combination she had not encountered before and found she wanted to understand better. "Something about this city, or this company, appears to have undermined my usual management of myself." She felt the smile arrive before she had decided to permit it. She had noticed, since Eduardo died, that her smiles had become less automatic and more true, which was one of the unexpected gifts of grief. It stripped the performative layer off things and left only the genuine ones. The genuine ones, when they arrived, were considerably better. "Seville does that," she said. "It is not polite about it. It simply takes what is not real and removes it, and what is left is what you actually are." "And what am I, by that measure?" he asked, and she heard in the question a genuine willingness to receive the answer, which was rarer than it should have been. She considered him as they walked. This contained correct, still managing himself man, who nonetheless kept saying true things in apparent spite of himself, who had dark eyes that had learned to be careful, and underneath the carefulness had not entirely forgotten how to be otherwise, who had lost people and managed the loss into productivity, and had, at a dinner table 8 years later, recognized with apparent surprise that this had not been an improvement. "Unfinished," she said, which was more direct than she had intended, and she looked at him to see how he received it. He stopped walking. She stopped a step later and turned to face him, and his expression was not offended and not defensive. It was the expression of a man who has been accurately described and is still deciding what to do about it. "Yes," he said, "that is very exact." "I did not mean it unkindly," she said. "I know," he said. "I did not take it unkindly. I took it accurately." They stood on the path in the afternoon light, with the orange trees on the slope below them, and the river in the distance, and the sound of the rest of the party at the fountain drifting up through the warm air. And something shifted between them, in the way that things shift when two people have been honest at the same moment and are now standing in the space that honesty creates, which is more open than either of them had been prepared for. "Tell me about your husband," he said, "if you are willing. Not because I require the information, but because you speak of him in a way that makes me want to know who he was." It was, she thought, the best question anyone had asked her in 18 months. She told him, and he listened, properly listened, with the follow-up questions she had already known he was capable of and had been curious about since the dinner, and the particular quality of his attention, which she had noticed from the first, was not performed interest, but the real kind, the kind that makes the speaker feel that what they are saying is worth having said. By the time they reached the end of the terrace and turned back, the afternoon had moved considerably further into evening than either of them had registered, and the rest of the party had gathered near the carriages and were beginning to look in their direction with the tactful concern of people who have decided it is not yet time to interrupt, but are beginning to revise that judgment. She thought, walking back toward the carriages, that she had just spent 2 hours being more honest than she had been with anyone outside Mercedes in 18 months. She thought, this is a problem, because he is English and is here for 6 weeks and has an estate in Wiltshire and a seat in the House of Lords and a life that is organized around a country that is not this one. She thought, I have decided I was not going to look for anything. She thought, I did not look for this. It found me, which is apparently a separate category. James, in the privacy of his rooms at the Posada where he was staying, with the Guadalquivir visible from the window and the sounds of the city's evening beginning outside, sat with his account books open in front of him and found, for the first time in 8 years, that he could not make himself care about them. This was so unusual as to be alarming. He was not a romantic man. He had never been a romantic man, or rather, he had been told so often, from such a young age, that the Duke's responsibilities required a certain kind of practical mind, that the practical mind had eventually become his actual mind, rather than a performance of it, and the romantic part, if it had existed, had been tidied away somewhere unreachable. He had been competent at admirations. He could recognize a beautiful woman, could find good company agreeable, could appreciate the particular pleasures of intelligent conversation when it occurred. But the deeper thing, the disorienting thing, the thing that interfered with account books, had not happened in 8 years, and he had, without consciously deciding, assumed it was not going to happen. He thought about the garden and the terrace, and the word she had used, unfinished, said not unkindly and received not unkindly, sitting somewhere between an assessment and an invitation, as though she were saying, here is what I see, and also here is that there is more to see, if you are willing to continue. He had spent 8 years finishing things. The estate, the accounts, the negotiations, the obligations. He finished things with the reliable efficiency of a man whose identity had become inseparable from the completion of tasks. It had not occurred to him until a Spanish noblewoman on a terrace above the Guadalquivir said the word aloud that the entire apparatus of his life might itself be unfinished, that all the completion was around the edges of something central that he had never addressed at all. He closed the account books. He thought about what she had told him about Eduardo, about the marginalia in the history books, about the continuing conversation with a man who was no longer there to have it. He thought about the quality of her grief, which was not the grief he had taught himself, which was grief pressed into productivity. Hers had a different texture. It had been converted not into efficiency, but into honesty, into a refusal to accept the counterfeit version of anything, which was why she arrived late to dinners and said unfinished to English dukes, and had dark eyes that assessed without apology, and occasionally gave way to a smile that arrived so completely, so without arrangement, that it reorganized everything. He thought, I have 6 weeks in Spain. He thought, that is not enough time. He thought, I do not know what enough time would look like, and I cannot at present see past this particular difficulty, which is to say that I know what I want, and I do not know if it is possible, and I am not certain whether the impossibility is actual, or is the habitual response of a man who has so long practiced telling himself that what he wants is not available, that he has stopped checking whether this is true. He sat with this for a long time. Then he wrote a note to the Marquise, accepting the next 3 invitations he had declined, which made the Marquise, when he received it the following morning, smile with the serene satisfaction of a man whose engineering is proceeding exactly as planned. October in Seville was the best month, and James, who had come to Spain expecting to notice nothing in particular, found that he was noticing everything. He noticed the way the evening light fell on the old walls of the city and made the stone look amber and warm, and entirely unlike the stone of English buildings, which was grey and honest and beautiful in a different, less forgiving way. He noticed the smell of the orange trees in the Marques's courtyard, and the sound of the river at night from his window, and the way the city seemed to exhale at dusk and begin a different and more genuine version of itself. He also noticed, with a precision that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain a professional distance from, everything about Catalina. He noticed that she moved through the Marques's gatherings with an ease that was not social ease, not the performing kind, but the ease of someone who has simply stopped needing the approval of rooms. He noticed that she was kind to the Marques's less interesting guests, with a genuine and patient warmth, not condescension dressed as warmth. He noticed that she laughed rarely and absolutely fully when she did, without the managed quality of social laughter. He noticed the way she held a wine glass and the way she tilted her head when she disagreed with something and was choosing how to say so, and the small unconscious movement of her hand when she was thinking, as though she were conducting an internal argument and had the slight physical habit of it. He noticed that in 5 further gatherings and 3 further conversations, and 2 occasions where they had both arrived at the same bookshop near the cathedral, within 20 minutes of each other, which he was now fairly certain was not coincidental on either side, she had said nothing to him that was not true. He found this extraordinary. He had spent so long in the company of people who said what was expected and received what was expected in return, such that honesty had come to feel like a disruption rather than a standard, that the simple, consistent experience of a person who would not waste words on performance was to him the most remarkable thing in a city full of remarkable things. He told her this on the second bookshop occasion, when they had been standing in the narrow aisle between the history section and the poetry for long enough that pretending to browse had become transparently inadequate. "You never say anything you don't mean," he said. She looked at him with a slight smile. "That is not quite true. I say socially necessary things that I do not particularly mean, when the occasion requires it. I have not entirely abandoned convention. But with me," he said, "in the conversations we have had, you have not said anything that was not true." She considered this. "No," she said, "I suppose not." She looked at him with the direct gaze that he had been trying, with diminishing success, to meet without something significant happening in his chest. "I find I cannot be dishonest with people I find interesting. It feels like a waste." "And you find me interesting," he said. "That is a dangerous question," she said. "I know," he said. "I am asking it anyway." She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the bookshop conducted its quiet business, the smell of old paper and leather, the muffled sound of the street outside, the particular warm stillness of a place where people have been reading for centuries. "Yes," she said, "I find you very interesting. I also find you very English, and very much the Duke of Ashmore, which are both true and both present difficulties." "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about the difficulties. And I do not have a solution to them," he said, with the honesty that had become, in her company, simply what he did. "I know that I have 5 weeks remaining in Spain. I know that Ashmore requires me in January. I know that there are 1,200 miles between Seville and Wiltshire, and that my life there has been organized around a set of obligations that I cannot simply lay down because I have met someone in a bookshop who makes every other conversation feel like a poor imitation of what conversation can be." He stopped. "I am telling you the difficulties because you have said you cannot be dishonest with people you find interesting, and I find I have contracted the same condition." She looked at him for a long moment in the warm, dusty quiet of the bookshop. He saw in her face the careful, clear-eyed assessment she had brought to everything, and underneath it, something more personal, something that the assessment was containing, but not entirely concealing. "Tell me about Ashmore," she said at last. "Not the estate. You, what it is to be you, inside the life you are describing." He had not been asked that question in 8 years. He stood in the bookshop in Seville and answered it, slowly and with more honesty than he had thought he possessed on the subject, and she listened and asked the follow-up questions, and what emerged was not a case for the impossibility of things, but a map, incomplete and without a marked destination, but a map. The weeks that followed had a quality that James could not have named in English, and found, when he borrowed from the Spanish around him, approximated by the word duende, a word he had heard the Marquess use about certain kinds of music, meaning something like the presence of authentic feeling, something dark and real beneath the surface of a thing, the quality that makes a song not just technically accomplished but actually alive. He and Catalina moved through the remaining weeks of October and into November in a state that could not, in the strict account of social proprieties, be called anything more definitive than friendship. They were always accompanied, always in the company of others, always within the sightlines of the Marqués or Mercedes, or some other presence that kept the form of things correct. But within that form something was building with the patient accumulation of true things said in each other's presence, the way music builds, not all at once but theme by theme, each new element adding to what came before, until the composition is suddenly, undeniably, something larger than its individual parts. He told her about his brother, whom he had not spoken of directly to anyone in 8 years, about Thomas, who had been 21 and had died of a riding accident 2 weeks after their father's death, and how the double loss in a single month had so thoroughly disorganized everything James understood about how the world worked, that he had simply built a new world on top of the ruins and pretended the ruins were a foundation rather than what they were, which was ruins. She told him about the things she and Eduardo had not said, the conversations left in the unfinished silence of a sudden death. She told him this without excessive grief, but with the precise, honest weight that it deserved, and he sat with it, in a way that she could see cost him something, because he was not a man who had allowed himself to sit with other people's grief in a long time. "You have been managing everyone else's loss," she said. "Your tenants, your estate, your seat in Parliament. You have been the person who holds things together for 8 years without anyone to hold things together for you." "Yes," he said simply. "Is there no one in England?" she began. "There are friends," he said. "Good men. Dalmore, who sent me here. Others. They would help, if I asked. I have not asked." "Because asking would mean admitting," she said. "Yes." She looked at him across the table in the Marques's garden, where they had been allowed the relative privacy of a corner while the rest of the party moved through the orange trees. The evening was warm for November, and the air smelled of something flowering nearby that she told him was late jasmine. "You are not actually here for shipping negotiations," she said. "I do not think you have been here for shipping negotiations since the 2nd week." He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as the one that came just before he said something honest that surprised him. "No," he said, "I do not think I have." "Why are you still here?" she asked. He met her eyes directly, in the manner he had, the grey-eyed level regard of a man who has decided that the apparatus of indirection is not worth what it costs. "You know why," he said. She did. She had known for 2 weeks, and had been proceeding with the careful discipline of a woman who understood that knowing and acknowledging were different categories with different consequences. "I am not going to leave Seville," she said. "I have Eduardo's house, and my life here, and my family, and everything I have built since he died. I am not willing to become an attachment to someone else's life in someone else's country." "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to." "Then what are you asking?" she said, and her voice was steady and her eyes were not. "I am asking," he said slowly, "whether there is a version of this that does not require either of us to disappear. I do not know if there is. I am not naive enough to pretend the difficulties are not real, or that love—" He stopped, and she saw the slight startlement of a man who has used a word he had not planned to use, and was now sitting with the fact of having used it, is sufficient on its own to resolve them. "But I find I cannot leave Spain in 3 weeks without saying it, because leaving without saying it would be the kind of cowardice I have already done enough of." The garden was quiet around them. The jasmine was in the air. Inside the house, the sound of the Marques's other guests moved and laughed, entirely indifferent. Catalina was quiet for a long moment, holding the word he had said, the one he had stopped at, the one that had arrived before his permission, and looking at him with the clear-eyed, honest gaze that had been the first thing about her that had undone him. "I am not ready to say it back," she said carefully, "not because it is not there, but because I need to know what it means before I say it. Eduardo taught me that words matter and should be said when they are true, not when they are convenient, and I do not yet know what true looks like for this, for us, given everything between us and the 1,200 miles and your estate and my house, and the whole geometry of 2 lives that were built without accounting for each other." "That is fair," he said. "But I want you to stay," she said, "through the end of November. Not to resolve things. I do not think they will resolve in 3 weeks, but because I am not ready for you to leave." He breathed out slowly, the breath of a man who has been holding something at careful distance for long enough that releasing it, even partially, is almost more than he can manage with composure. "Then I will stay," he said. What followed was 3 weeks of a particular quality that neither of them had a prior experience to compare it to. Not a courtship exactly, in the formal sense. There was no declaration, no formal presentation to family beyond what had already occurred through the Marquise. No arrangement of the kind that would be recognized as such by London or by Seville. It was something more like two people allowing themselves, for the first time in their respective widowhoods and managed isolations, to simply be in each other's company without pretending that the company did not matter. He walked with her through the old city on November mornings when the light was clear and the streets were quiet, and the Moorish architecture of the Alcazar and the cathedral rose above the narrow lanes with the grandeur of things built to outlast whoever built them. She showed him the city the way she knew it, not the version in the guidebooks for English travelers, but the version she had lived inside, which included a bakery in a back street where the bread was the best in Seville, and a garden behind a deconsecrated church, where Eduardo had proposed to her, and she had not been back to in 18 months, which she went to with James on a Tuesday afternoon, and stood inside for a long time without saying anything, while he stood beside her and also said nothing, which was exactly right. She came to the Posada once, with Mercedes as chaperone, and he showed her the view of the river from his window, and the account books that he had barely touched since October, and the draft of a letter to his man of business that had been revised so many times it was no longer legible, and she laughed at the account books, and was serious about the letter, and helped him find the version of it that said what he meant, which took an hour, and was the most useful thing anyone had done for him in years. She began to say, in the last week of November, in the careful way she said things when they mattered, not the word he had said, not yet, but things that meant it without saying it. She told him that the house in Wiltshire sounded like a place she would like to see, not stated as a plan, but as the kind of thing you say to a person whose life you have begun to want to know beyond the present confines of it. She told him that she had mentioned him in a letter to her older sister in Granada, and that her sister had asked questions that required more than a letter to answer, which made him understand that he was no longer the Marquess's English guest in the context of her life, but had become something else, something that required explanation. He extended his stay through December. He wrote to Thomas Bourne, who managed the situation with the devoted efficiency of a young man who has understood for some weeks that the shipping negotiations are a secondary concern, and arranged the necessary rescheduling and correspondence with Ashmore's lawyers and the estate managers and the House of Lords, all of whom were told that the Duke's business in Spain required additional time, which was entirely true. He told Catalina, in the second week of December, over coffee in her courtyard under the orange trees, that he had written to his steward in Wiltshire to determine what was structurally necessary for him to do in England in the spring, and what could be managed through correspondence, which was not a proposal, and she did not receive it as one, but was the practical language of a man beginning to build toward a different geometry of life. "You would spend part of the year here," she said. "If you would have me," he said. "I am not asking you to move. I am asking whether there is a version of this in which I rearrange things enough to give it a genuine chance." She was quiet for a long time. The orange trees dropped occasional leaves into the courtyard's fountain. Above the white walls, the Seville sky was clear and impossibly blue. "Eduardo used to say," she said at last, "that the honest life requires more maintenance than the comfortable one, that you have to keep choosing it, keep rebuilding it, because comfort will always be easier, and the honest life does not maintain itself." She looked at James with the direct, assessing, entirely present gaze that had undone him the first night and had been undoing him ever since. "You have been living the comfortable life for 8 years. This would require the other kind." "I know," he said. "It will be difficult," she said. "Not just the distances and the arrangements, the difficulty of two people who have each spent years alone inside themselves, learning to make room for another person again. I know what that costs. I did it once." "I have not done it," he said. "I did not, the first time. I managed things instead of opening them." He looked at her steadily. "I would rather try and fail at the real thing than succeed at the comfortable version for another 8 years. Catalina looked at him for a long time in the winter courtyard with the orange trees and the fountain, and the particular blue sky of Andalusia that had been above her entire life and above this strange, honest, unfinished Englishman for only 3 months. She said, "Then try." 2 words, plainly said, with the full weight of a woman who does not say things she does not mean. It was enough. The year that followed was not simple, because they had both been too honest with each other from the beginning to pretend it would be. There were months in England and months in Seville, and letters between, long ones, the kind that could only be written to someone you trusted with the unedited version of yourself, which they both discovered they had been carrying for years, these unedited selves, waiting for someone to send them to. His first visit to Ashmore with her was in the spring, when the estate was green and the rooms still had Thomas's things in them, and the grey English light was nothing like the amber Andalusian light, and she stood in the old library and moved through it, with the particular focus of a woman who assesses libraries the way other people assess character, which was, he had come to understand, exactly what it was for her. She told him what she thought of it honestly, which was that it was magnificent and cold, and that the cold was something he could choose, if he wanted, to do something about. He began, that spring, to do something about it. He also, that spring, moved Thomas's things from the rooms they had occupied for 8 years, not in erasure, but in the careful and overdue acknowledgement that the rooms had belonged to a living person and could again. He did it slowly, with Catalina beside him on the days she was there, and it cost him what he had always known it would cost him, which was considerable, and it also, once it was done, produced something he had not anticipated, the first deep and genuine exhale of an 8-year grief that had never properly been grieved. She found him afterward in the library, and she sat with him in the manner she had, which was not managing the feeling but simply being present inside it with him, and it was the most useful thing anyone had ever done for him in the 34 years of his life. They were married in Seville in the autumn, in the cathedral where the great columns rose to their impossible height, and the light through the high windows fell on the stone in the amber and rose of late afternoon. The Marquess wept openly and without embarrassment, which was entirely consistent with his character. Mercedes held Catalina's hand before the ceremony with the fierce, quiet grip of a woman who has seen her dearest friend through the worst and is present for the best. Thomas Bourne, who had become, in the year of arrangements and extensions and rescheduled correspondence, something close to indispensable, stood in the back of the cathedral and thought that this was the most remarkable business trip he had ever participated in. Catalina did not become English. She did not stop arriving late to things, or reserving judgment, or saying unfinished to people who needed to hear it. She brought to Ashmore, when she was there, the same honest, clear-eyed, entirely unmanaged quality she had brought to a dinner table in Seville, and he had entirely failed to be indifferent to, and the estate and its people responded to it the way all living things respond to something genuine, in a landscape that has been carefully maintained, but not always alive. He did not stop being the Duke of Ashmore. He was, and would always be, responsible for the estate and the tenants and the House of Lords and all the accumulated obligation of 8 generations. But he became, alongside all of that, and for the first time, a man who also knew what he wanted and had decided it was worth the considerable effort of choosing it. They divided their year between Wiltshire and Seville, which was impractical and expensive, and required the dedicated management of 2 estates and Thomas Bourne's considerable organizational abilities, and was, both of them privately agreed, the best arrangement they had ever been part of. She learned to find Wiltshire beautiful in its grey, honest, northern way. He learned to find Seville necessary, the way certain things become necessary once you have understood you had been living without them. On the anniversary of their first dinner at the Marquess's table, they sat in the courtyard of Eduardo's house, their house now, hers and his, under the orange trees, in the evening light, and he said, because he had been carrying it for a year and it was time, "Thank you for calling me unfinished." She looked at him, and the smile arrived the way it always arrived with her, complete and unmanaged, and entirely herself. "You are welcome," she said. "You have been attending to it." "I have," he said. "I expect it will require ongoing attention." "Most worthwhile things do," she said. "Eduardo told me that. I have found it consistently true." He took her hand. She did not take it back. Above them, the Seville sky moved into the deep, warm blue of an Andalusian evening, and the orange trees made their small, fragrant movements in the air, and below the courtyard walls, The old city went about its ancient business of being beautiful and indifferent and patient, as it had been for 1,000 years before them and would be for 1,000 years after, entirely unconcerned with the small and significant fact that two people, inside it, had chosen each other. And so ends tonight's tale. An English duke fell in love with a Spanish noblewoman. A story about a man who had converted grief into productivity and called it living, until a woman on a terrace above the Guadalquivir said one word that changed everything. A story about a woman who had loved once, deeply, and had made of her grief an honesty rather than an armor, and who opened, slowly and with full knowledge of what it cost, enough to let something true begin again. A story about the difference between finishing things and completing them, between managing a life and actually living it, between the comfortable version of yourself and the unfinished, honest, still becoming version that is the only one worth being. And now, our question for you tonight, the one we want you to answer in the comments below. If you were James, if you had spent 8 years managing everything and feeling nothing, and someone finally saw through it and said the word that was true, would you have stayed? Would you have extended your trip and rearranged your life and chosen the difficult, honest thing over the safe, settled one? Or if you were Catalina, if you had already loved and lost and built your life beautifully on your own, would you have been brave enough to let it begin again? Tell me what you would do if it were you in that story. We read every single comment and love hearing from you more than you know. If tonight's tale moved you, please give this video a like and subscribe to Tales of Whispering Hearts so you never miss a new story. Share this with someone who has been managing instead of living and needs to be reminded that it is not too late to choose the real thing. Until next time, may you find the person who says the true word, and may you be brave enough to hear it. This has been Tales of Whispering Hearts.